Good. I'm not getting confirmation on YouTube just yet, but I think we are.
Someone needs to click got it.
Oh.
All right.
And then Christina, can you maximize that window?
Okay. We ready?
I think
Are we on YouTube with sound?
I'm not seeing it live streaming yet. It is confirmed that we are, but yes, it is.
Okay. Is our sound working?
Feedback moment here for a second.
Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, feedback moment. Okay, I call to order this Thursday, May 25th meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:11 p.m. Thank you for your patience, folks who are here in the chambers, and also anyone who may have been anxiously awaiting on YouTube to watch the meeting. We were having some technical difficulties, but we got it figured out now. First item of business is citizens to be heard. So to be clear, this is for things that are not on the agenda this item. So if you're here for the public hearing about the landscaping ordinance, this would not be the time to talk. There will be time during that public hearing, which is coming up really soon. But if anyone is here to talk about anything else that isn't on the agenda this evening, you are welcome to speak. All right. And doesn't look like we have any other emails on anything not on the agenda either. So we will move on. The next item of business is approval of minutes. We have one set of minutes to approve from our April 27th, 2023 regular meeting. Oh, I apologize for note takers. In attendance tonight, we have planning commissioners Miles Lofton, Jill Tatton, and myself, Kai Marienfeld. We have city staff, Christina Dillard Crawford, Anna Englund, and Corey Shirtliff. Also, and Lexi, I'm going to forget your last name, Alexi Lamb from the Sustainability Department, as well as our City Council liaison, Luke Wojciechowski, in the back of the audience here. Okay, back to that. We have April 27th regular meeting minutes to approve. Anyone had a chance to look at the meeting minutes? Want to make a motion?
I motion to approve the minutes from April 27th, 2023.
All right. Miles Lofton
I'll second that.
made a motion. Jill Tatton seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Minutes approved unanimously. All right. Next, our big item on the agenda for this evening, a public hearing about proposed draft water efficient landscaping ordinance number 2023-08, an ordinance amending the text of the Moab Municipal Code, section 1706 definitions, 1709 supplementary requirements and procedures applicable within zones, and creating chapter 1710 landscaping standards, such as to include water efficient landscaping standards for new developments. This will be a public hearing and a briefing. Traditionally, I like to do the briefing and then the public hearing following the information provided. Are y'all okay with that, or is anyone in a rush? Okay, just want to confirm. So we will have a quick briefing from staff about this, the history, where we've been, where we're going. I will then open the public hearing, close the public hearing, and then next we have a potential action item on the same thing. All right, Alexi?
Quick, maybe a relative term here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
As concise as possible. maybe.
concise, targeted.
Okay. I think we're going to tag team this presentation a little bit because it's been a joint effort, but to generally walk you through our briefing piece, we're going to talk a little bit about where this update came from, the timeline for it, a framework of where we've been and where we are now, and then we'll go and directly review the text. Okay, so the reasons that we are working on a landscape amendment and having public hearing is because the water conservation plan called for it. And also the general plan has asked or suggested that we move forward with specifying vegetation, encouraging plant selection that makes sense with the water that we have here, maintaining and improving landscapes throughout the community and specifically highway landscapes, and adopting effective water management conservation practices. So we've tried to address all of those things within this update. There's also a bonus that's come around since this process started, which is that the state of Utah has a landscape rebate program that people in Moab would qualify for if we have a qualifying ordinance, and this one would be. So this process started back in August of 2021. Water Now Alliance and Western Resource Advocates partnered with the city of Moab, launching a project accelerator to help with the code update, and they have been active consultants throughout the process. The Water Conservation Plan update was approved and adopted, which is required by the state. The previous sustainability director and planning director and other people involved consulted with the planning commission and the city council on direction for where we want to go with a water efficiency ordinance. And more recently in October of 22, we held a workshop on screening and buffering with the planning commission. And in April, we talked about the general standard, which are more of the water conservation practices. This is what we had before as a landscaping ordinance. It was in the zoning section 1709, supplementary requirements and procedures. I don't expect you to have to read all of this, but the last screen there is the entirety of the landscaping requirements previously. So mostly I'm just showing it for reference. That's all we had previously. The two main things that we pulled over into the current one are the minimum landscaped area, which is 70%. We'll see that when we go to the text. And also some of the things related to screening being required, but we filled out the details a lot more. Essentially, aside from bringing over some information in this, none of the original text will be kept, and this will be added as 1710 as a landscaping standard section that will cover all of it. Okay, so before we get to the actual text, which is lengthy, this is just the outline to give you some context for what we will be looking at. It starts with the definitions that are being added to that section. Some of them had to be specifically added with relation to screening, buffering, and water efficiency, other landscaping, things that are in new ordinance that were not main features of the previous one. Screening and buffering will be the first section. Anna will go over that, the updates that are there. And then I'll go through the landscaping updates that we've added since then. We will also be happy to accept questions, answer questions as we go. Anything before we go to the text?
This is great. Thank you. Quick. Is this in the staff report that's in the agenda?
This isn't. This is just sort of an overview.
Would you mind sending this
Sure.
at some point to me? I think the way that this is presented with the history and kind of the basic overview is really helpful information for the public. I'd like to disseminate that.
Yes, I'll send it to you. Thanks. I'm going to switch over to the text.
Love a high level summary.
It makes it look very clean. Alexi's presentation.
As we've plodded through this for 2 years now, so.
Okay, so I'm going to walk through it. I'm going to focus on the sections that have changed since the Planning Commission saw it last, but you can stop me anywhere, ask me questions about specific things, even if they're not changes since our last discussion. Starting with the whereas, a lot of this goes through specific pieces of the general plan, state goals, and also the city's water conservation plan. It includes some of the things we just discussed with Water Now and Western Resource Advocates joining in as consultants for this. So we're going to skip down to definitions at this point. One of the things that came up in our previous discussions was, how do we define artificial plants? Could it be artwork or like a metal cactus. We added synthetic fibers or synthetic polymers to address the issue of microplastics and trying to minimize the amount that we would limit people who wanted to have a metal sculpture or ceramics or a glass flower or whatever they want in their yards. We had a request from another reviewer to define bare root. I think there's nothing particularly notable other than it's new. There was a division in defining buffer and buffering, which may have been in our last conversation.
I believe it was.
Yeah, we could.
The only emphasis that we wanted to add here was the location of excluding pools and spas in that component that had jumped around, but I think it did land actually where it originally was. So
Canopy tree, which comes up in the screening buffering sections, is defined here. We needed to do that because it is referenced. So essentially, it is a large tree that provides a lot of shade. We tried to make it as like unrestricted as possible, and kind of pulled this from other ordinances that were similar, but also reduce the shade crown that's required because Moab sometimes has smaller trees than other places. For reference, green highlighting is just appendices that we're referencing to make sure we update them if we change our appendices. Again, another reviewer asked for overhead irrigation. It's referenced or it is in our text, but I don't think the definition is particularly significant. We also, in our last discussion with you, had a little bit of a discussion about what a public right-of-way is. So we tried to add more information on that. And that's the end of our changes to definitions. Any questions about definitions? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Anna. What we have here first is what the entirety of the previous section was, and it struck out. Some elements may have come over, and Anna will elaborate on that.
So a lot of some of the elements from the original ordinance for buffer requirements have been brought over to this new, but it's all been completely reconstructed and it's not in the same format at all. So we just struck out the entire ordinance, previous ordinance. And then one of the things that we were considering as we were constructing this is how we would measure the distance between trees and shrubs and that type of thing in the buffer area. If it was like a odd number, like if it was 115 feet of the linear feet for the lot line that the buffer would go over. And so we just would say, you know, 1 per every 25 feet, and then it would be measured to the nearest whole number. So meaning like if it was 110 feet, then it would just be 1 tree and then 1 additional bush. So it wouldn't be an additional tree, just an additional bush with that. So on and so forth with that. And we included that in both the standard buffer area and the zoning boundary buffer area as well. It looks like you have something to say.
yeah, one quick add. So we are going to wordsmith these
Get it a
metrics
little
a little
better.
bit
Yeah.
further.
Oh,
Yeah.
just
But the idea is,
Yeah.
because again, we need this language to be correct in order to essentially match what was that concept matrix that we started out with. But what we're trying to capture here is a formula multiplier and a rounding mechanism. I think that's both achieved in concept here, but like we said, we're going to clean this language up so it is legally sound. Because right now it's
Do you want me to scroll
a touch
to-
choppy.
Hey, Lexi, real quick. Do you mean, can you go back to the
Yes.
definition? Thank you.
The definition.
I am reading this, sorry, the boundary buffering right here.
Okay.
I'm reading this as no more than 1 tree per 25 feet. Is that what's intended? Because I think
Yes, and so if you go down to the diagram just below, it explains what.
I understand the at least 1 tree per 25 feet, but I'm wondering if this also intends no more than 1 tree per 25 feet, because I
That's
think
part of the clarification we'll have to need. So
Yeah,
within this framework, a simple addition would be total number of trees shall be equal to
Yes.
equal equal to or greater than
At
this multiplier. That for this language, but I'm not even comfortable with quite that language. We
Okay.
might rework it a little bit further.
Yeah.
But the idea being it's essentially on a minimum lot area coverage, which is 50 by 100 feet. That's the minimum standard lot. We took that as the smallest multiplier set to see what would be a reasonable style of development. So we're actually backtracking from there and reverse engineering what that multiplier would be, which comes down to 1 for every 25 rounded to the nearest whole. That's where we're at.
But
So
this is not prohibiting you from having more than one.
we would
tree.
love for you to have more than one tree in this
Yeah.
section.
I think that
but
should
this
be
will be-
clarified because
Mhm.
I think this is unclear. As
Thank
it's written right now.
So we should say minimum number.
To
of
me, I
trees.
read shall as this is what it is
Correct.
and nothing else.
That could be challenged on either side of that. So we will clear that language up. Definitely. Thank you, Anna. Sorry to interject.
Sorry to interrupt. And that's probably, I was wondering if that's what you're alluding to. So
Mhm.
thanks, Anna.
Oh, no problem. And so we also are gonna just add diagrams to kind of, so people get a visual of what we're asking for. And then we've got the
That's
second
nice.
type of standard buffering. And then we've also just got the table per 100 linear feet, so it's a little bit easier to read.
Same note.
Um,
Noted.
And then I believe you guys have already seen this section. Were there any comments on screening request or buffer landscape requirements or any of that at this point?
I like how we're writing it with the balance of the buffering responsibility being on whatever the higher use is.
Correct.
Yeah.
Makes good sense.
Okay, did you have anything else on the section?
Unless any of you have any questions about it, I don't have anything to add.
Screen, or I think we're okay and settled on that. Commissioners don't have any questions.
Question with the tree buffers. I think it's wonderful to have, and certainly that you have the higher zoned property in the buffer zones who are providing most of that on the lot lines. Is there anything that we can do as a municipality to sort of assign responsibility for maintenance and upkeep of those trees outside of what the presumption would be, which is, you can maintain it, but the adjacent property owner doesn't have to?
With trees, it gets complicated because of state
Yep.
statutes.
Yep.
So we are looking into that, how within our regulatory or proactive requirements, it's going to interface with what is typically a civil
Yeah.
situation.
Absolutely.
So you're going to hear this a little bit further, but we're still teasing out these with a fine tooth comb in a hope that if the planning commission hates this, we can bag it now as we're working towards city council. And just spoiler alert, we're probably as a staff going to be recommended to table this item to give more public input and also bring it back when we maybe have a more full commission, because this is a pretty lofty ordinance. And I want to get a really robust experience. So that being said, I want to tease through all these major issues and then get into the questions and find the finer points that you have, so that when we do come back for an action,
Yep.
we're 100% polished.
That's great. Yeah, I was just wondering if, and
We didn't,
the-
yeah.
if
Short
we were
answer is we
allowed
looked into
to,
it, but we may be handcuffed as how much we can
For
actually
sure.
do that.
for sure. I was wondering if it was an in absence of something saying
Mhm.
otherwise, the presumption is that,
We could probably craft
Or
language
not.
like that.
because it would be nice if we're saying we have a commercial use coming in or who's in next to residential,
Mm-hmm.
they're putting all these trees in. You would hope they would be up on the maintenance of them, but it would suck for the adjacent property owner to have
A new burden.
a new burden
Sure.
of branches and all that kind of stuff that they would have to maintain, because legally, if it's overhanging their property, they can, and the neighbors that have to. It would be great to be able,
Mhm.
if we could, to say, and X, Y, and Z is responsible for maintenance and upkeep.
If I might, also Lexi and Anna really quick. Anna had been also, in addition to this section, compiling and doing an audit of all these sections that actually incorporate buffering into the base code. Right now, the way this is written is actually sufficient, saying where where it applies or otherwise is relevant, this shall be the standard. Similar to what you're almost saying in that context, but even within our own code. So what the next step would be to do is take Anna's audit and incorporate that of anywhere we want to apply this specifically. So right off the bat, we're obviously thinking of multi-household uses in residential districts and in commercial districts, as well as maybe some more common commercial uses that some of their buffering is almost too aggressive, where it almost makes development
It restricts the greatly property.
Yeah.
As far as
infeasible
landscape.
just off of buffering alone. And that's hard to tell somebody, no, you can't do this professional office building because your buffering isn't good enough. So we want to tone that in, but that'll be a commission decision as new regulation type material. Where do you want to apply these new standards? That'll be coming next time.
Okay, we'll move into the general standards. A lot of this you've seen before. We tried to make sure that it was clear that the purpose is more than just water management. We don't want to be short-sighted. It involves managing sound and dust and erosion and stormwater management. That there are a lot of benefits to the community in terms of managing urban heat island effect, things like that. So that water is very important in this ordinance, but we wanted to be holistic and including all the things that landscapes are important for. Again, we struck out the previous ordinance. And in this case, this first change in landscaped areas and where landscape is required, we wanted to make sure that we were including people's required landscaping is in the front yard and street adjacent side yard. And we wanted to be sure that the things that are appropriate could apply to people's backyards as well. So it wasn't necessarily that your backyard's a jungle and your front yard's gravel or something to that effect. That said, not everything applies to your entire yard. Okay, so going into this direction, the general standards, as we kind of saw in the outline, it sets several things in order that we will get to at the very end, apply to different types of plans. So the first thing we did is setting a minimum amount of plant material. We did have some questions from reviewers about how that's measured. So we did say that it was a spread of plants at maturity. Canopies of deciduous trees, as it is said now, it says they don't count. The reason is you could plant one tree and cover your entire yard and you would have no other plants. However, we have had discussions because we don't want it to be too complicated, but trees are really valuable. So just counting their trunks, if you have opinions on that, we are open to them if this is the appropriate way to handle that. Interesting question. Things we also added here. So we have the trees in the right of way. Trees planted in park strips shall be from those identified on the approved plant list, or non-irrigated water requirements be hand watered until establishment. We added this because of our last discussion related to whether you had to have irrigation to have a tree so it wouldn't die. So there are 20 plants on the approved plant list now, 20 trees that are considered low water that you could plant without installing irrigation. 3 of them are native and I'm trying to think. And 3 of them were recommended by Wild Landscapes in town. Beyond that, we also wanted to point out that this is only for trees of the right of way, and it does not require trees on private streets as it is written. If we wanted to do that, we would have to change how it's written. Okay, all trees planted in the right of way with medium or higher must be irrigated. So that's trying to keep trees from dying. It also gives people some incentive to plant things that require less water. As far as measurement, it's trunk to trunk. Okay, the next standard is artificial plants. In the previous one, we had said that artificial plants were prohibited except for in active recreation areas. We have changed that to say it's not allowed, does not count toward your required landscape area. So you could have artificial plants somewhere in a planter or on your porch or in your backyard, but it would not count toward your required landscape area, which again is your front yard and things that are street adjacent on the side. We changed a little bit with the approved plant list to try to address the discussion we had at the last meeting about whether your peonies or your grandmother's roses or whatever plants you have that are existing can stay. Currently, we have the number at 90% of everything should be 90% of forbs, shrubs, and trees, and 100% of ground covers and ornamental grasses should be off the approved plant list. That number could change. It could be 80% or 50%, whatever you would prefer. So this was our attempt to let people keep some of the established plants that they have that may not be on the list already. We also, as discussed in the last meeting, exempted spring bulbs. They don't have to be on the list if they don't require additional irrigation. And we added at the end an approved criteria for getting on the plant list. That includes, I think it can't be a noxious weed, that it's appropriate for Moab's plant hardiness zone, and that you provide some kind of documentation that's adapted to the environment here, including soil, the amount of rainfall we get, things like that. So that's in Appendix C, and we can go there if people want to see. It's a short list. The next standard is cool season turf. We did not make any changes there, but it is worth noting since it's a public hearing, that it says that it cannot be more than 10% of the total landscaped area or 200 square feet of turf, whichever is greater. And that is a major change that this ordinance would have for Moab. Mulch, we only made a small change here. Before it said 2 inches. Christina had seen that 3 inches could help with preventing some invasive species. So we created a range there. And we also said that you can't have non-porous material under there because we wanted, part of the advantage of mulch is that water can percolate into the soil. So we wanted to establish that if you have mulch, water needs to be able to infiltrate. Going to our next change. These are pretty minor, but we're in the section on water budgeting at this point. Special features can give you extra water in your budget. So if you have 5% of your total irrigated area with special features, then you get an extra gallon in your water budget. If you have 10% with a special feature, and this includes gray water, which was specifically called out in some of our plans, then you can get 2 extra gallons, or you can combine it with another bonus, which would be previously it said approved plant list. If you put a plant in on the approved plant list, since we have moved to a required plant list, we can provide an incentive here for things that we want in Moab, such as native plants or pollinators, but we can also remove that if we don't want to add a bonus for anything in particular. Okay, I think this part is also we're stopping at, even though there are no significant changes, just because it does affect who has to meet which general standard. All of the levels of planning. So we have 3 broken out levels of plans that people would submit. The lowest level is for smaller projects. It's more likely that somebody would have to get that. And so we created tiered, where you could do a prescriptive or a water budget. And then as you move up into the more advanced plans, then you have to have a water budget. But all 3 types of plans have to have a required amount of plant material. They have to follow the rules on the artificial plants, and they have to pick plants off the plant list according to the text. After that, it starts varying based on which level of plan they are as to which of the 4 through 9 they have to follow. So the lowest level of plan does 4 through 7 in addition to 1 to 3. So they don't have to have irrigation, or they can not do 4 through 7 and they can have a water budget, which gives them flexibility in terms of the amount of turf people have where they have mulch and their water features. level one plan. And to note, in case anybody is noticing, we did change the numbering of the plans in order for the site plan to match the landscaping plan. So they would both be
I would
one.
say that's helpful. It'll be really confusing.
So level one landscaping plan corresponds with level one site plan. In that case, they're going to have general standards 5 through 9, which excludes cool season turf limits because they will have a water budget that they have to follow. And at the highest level of plans, everything's required. I'm not going to talk a lot about the documentation. Mostly it's submitting a plan, but if anybody has questions or wants to discuss those, we can.
Can you clarify with like just a couple examples of how turf would work in various applications, whether it's a single family residence that's, wouldn't even need legislative approval for anything, to a level 1 site plan to level 2? So you're saying that level 1 and 2 could ostensibly have more turf than is allotted if it meets their water budget,
Yes.
whereas a single family residence would be restricted to,
Level one.
Just a level 2.
okay,
Level 1 and level 3 will be restricted on turf
Level one has 2 options.
or
Mhm.
right.
They could do a prescriptive option and they would be limited on turf, or they can produce a water budget and then they would be unrestricted on turf as long as they're within their water budget. We think that probably most like family residences would probably only come into, this would apply as people come through like to ask for a permit or something. So they're most likely to come through at a level 1, at which point they would choose whether they want to do a prescriptive option and have the grass limitation, or whether they want to pursue a water budget, in which case they would have more flexibility on turf.
I might even say they come at
I can
what was
go
it?
up.
What was level 1 now is the general. So
Yes,
most
sorry.
that might be confusing for us for a short time, but
We'll
that,
get used
that base level general
Mhm.
plan is going to be your building permits. That's what I'd say 80% of residents are getting. They're large multi-households or mixed-use developments are going to be when you're getting to level 1s and level 2s. So that general is going to be what we think of when we're thinking local residential development,
so that wouldn't apply.
which wouldn't apply.
So general landscaping,
Mhm.
oh, sorry, can you?
There's a
it just
there's a
got hit.
general
Can
plan.
you scroll
standard.
down? Can you
and then-
scroll down?
Yes.
Okay, stop. stop.
Choose to
Yeah.
not have it apply by choosing the water budget.
Mhm.
So you, either be restricted or
Through
unrestricted
7 or 9.
by doing the water budget.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Right, general plan, not level 1 because the numbering's changed.
Good.
Okay, any other questions on that?
If you've got a bunch of bluegrass and you go to build a carport, better think about if you want a carport or the bluegrass.
And that's going to become a really intense reality. So as a part of maybe even for our next planning commission meeting, certainly for city council, we were going to do a mock
I think that's really helpful.
application process of here's this property, here's the site plan, here's what the conditions are. Okay, they're going new build. Oh, here's a redevelopment. Here's the structure. How are you doing that? Or here's a truly, kind of our mid-century style subdivision, and it's 90% turf grass. They want to build a carport. What happens?
Yeah.
So we're going to pick our kind of most intensive and probably our most common processes we're going to see and show this is what will have to be done, which I think will kind of put the rubber to the road of this is what this ordinance will actually enact.
Yeah. And I think a workout of like, could it work? And people are gonna want to know if they pick the water budget option, if they can keep their full front yard on Tusher with turf
That
grass.
We
would
do
be-
have some
go ahead.
examples.
Yeah,
Let me see if we have them in here.
I think just being able to, people like certainty, right? I think
For
that
sure.
would be,
Take a standard lot,
Possible, yeah.
subdivision lot that is this much and run it through. But I think like Lexi's showing,
Yeah, and we can make these a little more concrete, but our consultants did provide us with some examples of if you have a certain amount of space that is high, medium, or low, where you would come out on your water budget, and whether or not you would be within like allowed amount. So we can kind of mock those up so they're a little more like visual instead of just tables to show people what that would translate to in terms of your high water budget plants and how much of it you could have. Yeah, I think they also have some examples with pools that I should find, but okay. I think that's the end of our changes in the main text. There are some changes in terms of documentation, but those will change as we finalize the actual code as to what people are going to have to document. The main change here is working on a worksheet for people who decide to have a general plan with a prescriptive option. What do they have to submit? At this point, it looks like what they will end up having to submit is a list of plants that are grouped by hydrozone, which is included in our plant list, whether high, medium. So you could reference the list to get that. And we're thinking about some way for them to calculate an estimated size, like a large shrub, small shrub covers X amount of square feet to let people figure out whether or not they have 25% of their lawn, or not lawn, their yard covered. So that's a work in progress, but we're going to finalize it as we know what the actual provisions are. However, I did want to mention it just because we want to keep the reporting requirements for people who are trying to, let's say, build a carport to be reasonable. And so far, that's the minimum amount that we think we need to do this, other than sort of check boxes to say that they have in fact done the other things. Cool. And with that, that's the last thing I had. I'll bring up this approved plant list criteria briefly, just so you can see what it actually looks like. And we have reached the end. I'm happy to answer questions.
I might suggest we open up for public hearing after the briefing and then enter in discussion during action item to get feedback on some of those questions posed.
Okay, sure. I like it. All right. Screen back up here. Okay, thank you, everyone. That was really great. It's come a long way. Lots of hard work. Okay, that is the end of the briefing. I will now open the public hearing on proposed draft water efficient landscaping ordinance number 2023-08 at 6:47 p.m. If you are here to speak at the public hearing or have something to say, we ask that you just approach the microphone, state your name, and then you have 2 minutes, or there's not many people here, so try your best to keep it to 2 minutes, and we will note your comments. So, anyone want to start?
Thank you. My name is Sarah Heffron,
Hi, Sarah.
and I want to just really applaud all the work that's gone into this and the thoughtfulness. And it feels, as Corey said, lofty. And as an obsessive gardener, I know that there's parts of me that's like, oh, but I just want to do what I want to do, which is kind of what we all want to do.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the reason that we're doing something so ambitious is because we are in a time that demands us to really go for it. So I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this. 2 minutes. I'll
You
just
can go. It's fine.
I'll
We
just
have
very
time.
briefly name any of you who've seen the recent water reports. It totally transformed how I perceive water, is that our aquifer may have taken between 60 and 1,000 years. We have this incredibly precious resource. So in addition to being, just having good wisdom of how are we going to take care of future generations, it's also like, oh my gosh, we are so blessed with this pure, wonderful water. So in some ways, out of respect to the water, how can we use it wisely? So I love kind of everything that was presented, even though I can feel the little and I want to just name that two super simple little sentences, like landscaping is so complex. And I know we're not really addressing indoor water, but as Kaya mentioned, it's taken us 2 years to get here. I would hate to think that we would need to wait another 2 years, knowing how much development is in the works right now, when we could put in literally 2 little A and B of all faucets and fixtures are water sense, and all appliances are Energy Star. And it's like 2 very simple things that would save so much water. As like, if we decide like, oh, this is a good idea in 2 years, the amount of development that's already happened where we're like, oh, actually, could we redo those? Like, no, we're not gonna, that's gonna be annoying. People are gonna be pissed. Like, this is something that's so easy to do right here and now. EPA estimates that we can save 6,800 gallons annually per household just by using WaterSense. And with these wonderful, ambitious goals of saving 50%, if we use the indoor, a couple very simple indoor measures, it may allow us to reach that ambitious goal. And actually, because treating water is expensive and energy intensive, it may also help us to reach our carbon neutral goals, which are also in the works. So I would just be wildly enthusiastic and appreciative if we didn't have to wait another year or two to put 2 very simple things. And I'm happy to send the language that the St. George has put into their ordinance. Again, it's so simple compared to what you're having to deal with landscape. And if I was a homeowner buying a new home, I would be so grateful to buy something that was already installed, because I'd be saving money. I mean, it's just, there isn't, whereas the irrigation, as much as I support everything you're doing, it's a lot more like, hey, I want my peonies, whatever. I want my peonies and like, I'm there. Anyhow, and then I'm gonna close with a question about how we handle existing landscapes, because it sounds like this is all around new landscapes. So that may be a question for another time, but I am curious. So
Thank you, Sarah.
thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you,
And
Sarah.
I'm crossing my
And we
fingers.
will, if you hang out until the discussion time, we can actually answer those questions first in the discussion.
Needs to go to the little thing for my daughter.
Oh, okay.
Recognition thing it said. So I'll hang out for 10 minutes and
Oh,
I can.
okay.
Great.
We can do
That'll
that.
be good. Yep.
Do that.
Are you here for anything? Okay. All right. Less than 10 minutes. I will now close the public hearing at 6:52 p.m. Thank you, Sarah. To address the suggestions, we have definitely discussed those before. We discussed them a month ago, I think, at the meeting, something like that, 2 months ago.
Fixture and indoor efficiency standards.
Yep.
Yes.
And the conclusion on that was putting you on the spot. And
Sure.
Alexi,
Alexi, do you want to handle that question, or we can enjoy it? We can.
Sure.
there's-
about why not those right now?
Essentially, the location that we found that and investigated was, I think, in Washington County, St. George area, and their code was structured differently than ours. So whereas they were updating more of an efficiency code, we're updating a landscaping code, and we were having trouble fitting it into this particular part of how it's written. However, the Planning Commission gave us instruction to actively pursue it after this.
Oh, we did. I thought, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was like, I feel like I'm having deja vu. Is there, oh, go ahead.
I
Corey.
would note, in addition to that, given Sarah's statements and passion about that, is what has helped in the past is a citizen advocate to be the mechanism to bring that to the attention. And I know that some of the complexity in handcuff that we do have as staff is we're a directive agency, meaning we get directed from the city council and the planning commission. We have your direction, pursue this, but that fits now neatly into the queue of the myriad of other text amendments we're processing. So maybe that's something that we can reach out to Sarah as the name text amendment submittal, and she can be the champion of that, but coordinate with staff. The major element of this is that we're handling basically a small component of our municipal code, and what indoor fixtures are going to now integrate themselves into the building department and with the building codes. So that link would be while it is essentially a simple, when we talked about with the city council member, collection of language adjustments that are maybe a couple sentences long, pretty easy change. The implications really dig deep into a lot of different code books, and that's what the complexity and legal issues will be. But not to say that we can't overcome like other communities. I think we can. It'll just take the metaphors rather than one silver bullet. We want a quiver of arrows. This is our landscaping efficiency ordinance. I'd love to do a general efficiency water ordinance pertaining more to the development aspects versus landscaping, to approach it from kind of those different perspectives. So that's a little bit of report there. I'd love to continue communicating about that if our citizens willing to keep talking to us.
I'm happy to continue talking. My concern is just that it gets in the queue and the queue doesn't come up for 2 or 3 years.
Which is exactly
Totally
here as
right.
well, which is why I think if we have a citizen submittal, it goes to the top of the list.
Yeah.
We are obligated to hear that, and the city council is obligated to hear that.
What do I need to do next?
We'll reach out. We'll coordinate with that.
You'll tell me what to do.
We will.
Yes,
And
that'd be
I-
fantastic.
So I think you have my
We
email
do.
address.
Yes.
Yes.
Is there ever a situation where we could put some sort of incentive in with the water budget where if you also install low flow fixtures in your house, it knocks something off of your requirements for the outside landscaping? Could that be a mechanism to have it in here?
I think state code, the new incentive program might cover that as well. Let me double check.
It has similar
Because
language.
that'd be a way to sort of sneak it, not sneak it in. I don't want
It
to
would
say
be an
sneak,
opt-in
but
incentive program, which is
it would
ultimately when people are
Well,
doing
and-
these things, they're doing them anyway.
yeah, flag
So
it for people.
If we're having regulatory or obligatory regulations,
Mhm,
that's what we're needing to cover, because I think people that would opt in would be doing it anyway.
mhm.
But there are options for bonuses within this ordinance, I think.
There
And
are.
then just quickly, like the unintended consequence, I would hate to see someone be like, oh, great, okay, I'm gonna be able to keep my acre of lawn.
Yeah.
So then it, like, to just use all their savings
Totally.
on lawn, so I just be careful with that.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, nothing that extreme, but
But I like
that
the
would be
idea
interesting.
generally. Just-
Right. And then
interesting.
your other question was related to existing things and what happens. So essentially, existing landscapes would get to stay the way they are until they they have some kind of change they're making to the property that requires, let me go up here,
Submission of the building.
like a building permit, something
Yeah.
like that. And then they would, at the same time, have to come into compliance with city code.
So there might be that would address more incentives, like the $1.50 per movie.
Totally.
Yeah, upon approval of this ordinance and whenever, similar to dark sky, there was an amortization period to allow people to come to compliance before it became per se a violation. The way we're approaching this is slightly different or similar to how we're going to propose the new dark sky update, which is upon approval of this ordinance, all legally approved developments that aren't consistent with this would become legal non-conforming, which is a protection status over that property. So long as no adjustments are made to that property, they can continue in perpetuity as is. But if they want to expand, increase intensity, or change use, they have to bring the property in compliance with all city code. And that's a universal metric that is within our ordinance as is. So it takes landscaping and puts it into essentially the context of structural and building use. We're viewing landscaping the same way we'd be viewing roofs and walls and structural elements. So if a building was too close to the property line, that would be legal non-conforming, because once upon a time they got a building permit that said they can do that, but the code has changed since then. So if they want to expand that, they'll have to now move that wall further away from compliance. The same aspect would be if you had a full property of turf and want to change use, expand, or do something different, you'd have to come to compliance with landscaping before you could do that, which is a pretty intensive step. I don't know many other communities that are taking this approach out in Utah, outside of parts maybe of St. George and Las Vegas. So it's very regionally cutting edge. That's right.
Mhm.
But does that answer? I know it's slightly complex, but for the record, I wanted to have the kind of clear legal language that anybody watching can understand too, because that's all in that ordinance as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Sincerely.
Yeah, thank you all.
Enjoy your time with your job.
Yes.
Okay. Let's discuss. I should move on. We now have an action item on the agenda. A proposed draft water efficient landscaping ordinance 2023-08 and ordinance amending the Texas Moab Municipal Code, section 17.06 definitions, 17.09 supplementary requirements, procedures applicable within zones, and creating chapter 17.10 landscaping standards, such as to include water efficient landscaping standards for new developments. This is a briefing and possible action.
This briefing, if we wanted to, and Anna worked on some of these materials, would go through the zoning analysis, which we do for all text and zoning amendments. However, for sake of time, if the commission feels comfortable, because they were in the packet and available to everybody, we don't have to go through this line by line, given we've just gone through the whole.
Yeah,
ordinance
that's
as
fine.
is. I might convert that time back to Alexia to have some of those outstanding questions addressed. That's my suggestion, but whatever.
Yes, yes.
Commissioner
Does that sound good to you? Will?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, I'll go through my questions. If you have comments along the way, please let me know if you have other questions as well. So the first one was for required plant material. We include the spread of mature plants except deciduous trees because of the amount of space a deciduous tree could cover. The trunk would count. And the question is that an appropriate measure of living plant material for the 25%? Everything at maturity and the trunk of the tree, but not the spread of the tree.
I think that makes sense. Or my one mulberry in the front yard at my house would be all of my landscaping. And that would not be great.
Yeah, I was just to play devil's advocate thinking like if you wanted to value a certain percentage of the canopy,
Mhm.
you know, and to me it would be a fairly small percentage because of that same reason. Like you don't want one tree to be all the landscaping, but if you wanted to consider valuing a certain percentage of that canopy area as plant material versus just the trunk of the tree. Because at least thinking about like water budgets and how many plants you would have in an area, you know, trees take a lot of water. And so if you were then required to plant a variety of other plants to meet the plant material, you know, guideline, but have these big trees that are eating up your water budget, that could become tricky. So some percentage of that canopy, even if it was like 15%, something small, could allow you to balance that.
I don't know where that tree gets water, but it's not for me. We'll say.
Usually have pretty
I've
deep
never
roots.
watered it a day. It's getting it from somewhere.
Yeah, the mulberries and the cottonwoods do pretty good at tapping into.
I
a
was
lot
gonna
of ground.
say.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Or just everything else you water percolates down. And then,
Yeah.
Do you think we should count a percentage of the canopy or leave as is? Or something else?
I don't have strong feelings.
that was just a suggestion based on like the idea that
Yeah, it
Yeah.
counts for
Mhm.
something.
yeah, that having a big tree counts for something. So if there was like a small percentage or
Yeah, I
metric,
think
would be
that
worthwhile.
makes sense, actually.
Mhm.
So we're calling for 25% overall to be landscape, with the
Mhm.
mature canopy of the tree can't be the entirety. 10?
I was gonna say guessing at a number is harder for me.
10?
5, 10, like even if it's a very small portion, like
Yeah.
5% of the canopy plus the trunk could be, counted as plant material, and that's it. And that way you'll at least end up with a few other shrubs, and even if you have a monster of a tree, you'll still end up with a few other shrubs and plants that would kind of give you a
Can we just give a general
vibe.
request
I
to
think
figure out
so.
something that makes sense?
Yeah, and we could
That
do
might
it
be
a
a
little
better way.
like turf, like 10% or X square feet or something
Yeah.
like that.
Whichever is
Yeah.
Yeah.
greater.
This is an area where I think through the process over time, we may come back to amend similar to how we've done the other ordinances where we may find incentives or disincentives that we didn't,
Oh, yeah.
is impossible to forecast. I mean, truly, we are trying to see from every angle, but until it's in place and we get really unique scenarios. But if somebody is doing a budget and they're like, well, why on earth would I do this? If I am not getting counted for it, I'll just do that. That's going to maximize my dollars. Maybe if it's a developer, maybe they won't see that. So we'll lose what could be, in my view, is that really advantageous living plant material, which is the multi-purpose of canopy trees. So I think giving it credit is a good call, but how much? If you have 25 foot canopy, well, that might be too much credit. So I think we can workshop that.
Yeah, we
further.
can do that. We can try to look at scale drawings and things and see what
Mhm.
seems reasonable.
Yeah, that's great.
The next one was trees in the right of way. We expanded the trees appropriate for park strips along the roads. The trees on the list are unrestricted for other relevant right of way. So they still have to be off the approved tree list, but we specially marked some for park strips because of size and roots. And a lot of those were drawn from Grand Junction's list. Okay, so we don't require irrigation for low water trees. And I was wondering if we had a long discussion about irrigation last time, if those seemed like they addressed your concerns.
They do to me when
Okay.
we were, I mean, it seems like that was a simple outcome of what we kind of landed on last time, which was, irrigation is expensive. And so if we're requiring people to already go to the expense of putting trees in their, in their right of way zones like that, at the very least, we could give them some options for something that didn't also require the expense of irrigation.
Yeah, I think so.
I'd say the city engineer was on board with the commentary that came out
Cool.
of that. He does not obviously want to see away with that aspect of it.
Right.
But I think he's totally willing, however we can make it work to get to the result that's going to be the benefit.
I would also be curious to see those plant lists of the recommended trees and stuff like that.
Yeah, I can
That
pull it
came
up.
with our information packet. I didn't find it in there.
Anna, could you pull up the plant list?
Yeah, it's,
Oh, I'm gonna fail at multitasking. Or I can work on it in a sec. The other follow-up question was also that we're not requiring trees on private streets. Is that something you want to pursue in this ordinance or leave it at right
on a
of way?
private street. I don't know where you'd put it.
So that's something
Honestly.
in the next, what I'll imagine is a couple of months, all these site plans that we've been on the future agenda item list continually telling you are coming. I'm what is it? The sky is falling, chicken. They are coming. So we have a number of projects.
Site plans are coming. The site plans are
The
coming.
one certainly is already preemptively scheduled. I think for June 8th, it was going to be scheduled for tonight, but we had to postpone. Why I bring that up is many of these that are in action will, as far as the site plans intact now, won't have this ordinance apply directly at the moment. However, the trend of development is going this way where large development parcels are not going through major subdivisions anymore. They're going through private level developments, and you all know this obviously, and going through the townhome mechanism style instead. What this would do is like we had seen with the Aggie townhomes, for all intents and purposes, it looks and feels like subdivision, but it's a private development through townhomes. Limiting this to right-of-ways would basically be on Aggie Boulevard in that particular example context, rather than in through the neighborhood context of that. So if we apply this, we could, I think, because this originally was coming from the engineering department, we'll obviously want to vet it further with them, how they believe it can integrate with the utility infrastructure and the public improvement infrastructure, make sure it correlates nicely. But requiring this, I think, will give a better consistency through the community with these large developments that are probably in the future of what are coming, rather than people doing major subdivisions. So that's my big pitch: is large subdivisions aren't happening anymore. We are seeing these kind of unique things. This would be a way to capture those developments as well.
So you'd shown, when you scrolled up a little bit, it had those 6 recommended native non-irrigated that would be an option for folks.
So all of
They
the
keep an opinion behind alive.
things in low
but-
water category. And they're more down here, also in the low water category, that are also park strip trees. So anything low would be, and also having some sort of park tree designation. And then, you know, there are others that are also medium or higher that are designated as well.
But for the medium or higher, it would require the
Mhm.
irrigation.
You would need irrigation. But we have 20 of them on here that fall in the low category. And we also have a process for adding trees. So if people have a tree they think should be there and it meets the criteria, they could add it.
Yeah, and that's my hope, is that we can really dial in that process for adding plants to the list one way or another, because that will also save a lot of people's roses or otherwise, because at the end of the day, roses are not a particularly consumptive plant and survive pretty darn well, especially some of the like wilder varieties survive pretty darn well here.
Yeah.
And so there's no reason to, you know, disallow stuff like that. Grandma's
I don't know about the private streets, coming back to that.
Sure.
I'm curious to see how it played out. Is there like
Another aspect I was thinking about,
and
for
that's
framing that
still
might
only
be
if there's a
understandable.
city, that's still only if there's a right of way on the private street?
There will be, it's not a city right of way. It's not based on our new definition as well. But it's a private street. So it is an access way designated and restricted to access. It's a private street. This would be similar to maybe say a PUD that we're familiar with. The access way is maintained by the HOA as a private street. Those right-of-way trees could be factored into that public improvements piece of that PUD or townhome development or condo, whatever it might be that is engaging in that private development. Usually, or traditionally, the city had looked at private developments as, okay, here's your property border. That's all you. It's all us. We had our city infrastructure mains stop at the border, everything halted. Because of state updates, water is now having to be conveyed through city-owned maintenance and mains, because water is obviously sensitive. Sewer is very quickly going that same direction at the state level, but is already by policy in our perspective. So now mains are going on to private developments to feed these different types of dwelling uses. And we're quickly, I think, evolving to the point of where this development trend is taking off so much that it was not so much a loophole, but it was a style of development that wasn't actively used or on large scales. That's changing. And now the city's needing to come into effect and say, hey, these important factors need to be maintained, even if it is your property. So widths of roads are often the very first thing to get restricted on private developments. But what that does later on is the HOA or whoever wants to convert it and convey it and dedicate it to the city, it doesn't meet our standards. Therefore, it probably doesn't have adequate sizing for fire apparatus in a general subdivision context. It'll obviously have access for emergency in a private development context, but we're we're starting to see all those regulating back. So this is us just jumping on this trend of saying we should treat these private developments probably very similar to how we're treating major subdivision or public developments. Because these are larger developments, I'm also not as fearful of the burdens on individual owners of those places,
Yeah.
as it's probably going to be factored into.
I think so. I was just fixated on the right of way thing where it was like, are you likely to even have things in a PUD, for example, that qualify as a right of way?
Typically, yeah. So if we qualify as right away, we're meaning access. Because the minimum sizing requirements for PUDs, MPDs, or large scale developments as overlays, where it was odd is private developments, and now their townhomes used to be 6 or 7 townhomes. Now we're seeing 167 townhome unit projects coming in. That's not a townhome project, that's a subdivision.
Yeah.
But they're going through this other mechanism. And so what this would do is bring them back into what should be that larger development context. I think that scale jump
Yeah.
kind of can resonate of, oh, I see
Totally.
what's happening.
Yeah.
And that's where we're grappling with that, not only with utilities, but the public improvements, meaning sidewalk accessibility, because private streets don't often always have to have all those things. But they ought to at certain sizes.
I think in that instance, it makes sense to apply it and as well.
And again, city code, as long as it does take the install, is not concrete. If we get it in and we're having apparent issues, we can always come back and redact that a lot easier than implementing it after the fact.
Luke was bobbleheading back there, so I'll take that as council's.
I can double check with engineering too and get their feedback.
Yeah, yeah. It's just, it's hard to me to envision in the context of the PUD I am familiar with, because we have
Right.
private streets because they're too narrow to be public streets.
Right.
And there's no sidewalk on one side, and I'm just
Right.
like, you're putting a tree where?
But that's where it could, using our functions,
Yeah.
go into
Yeah.
the ownership areas.
Of course, yeah.
Versus, like
Yeah.
that PD, there's no.
Yeah, it's like I have
so-
a water main, but it's under the driveway.
Right.
So.
Right.
As I had to dig up this year. It happens. Okay, cool. Thanks, Alexi.
All right, we'll go on to the next one. We saw the definition updated with synthetic fibers and synthetic polymers. Does that address the concern about limiting art?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Mhm.
Approved plant list. We have 90% of annuals, trees and shrubs and 100% of ground covers and grasses. Was that what?
Yes.
Is 90%, like, do you like the approach, and is 90% the right number? I can also find it in the
If
text.
you want to,
wanna
if
see
you
it.
want a carport, but you've moved into your grandmother's house and she has 50-year-old rose bushes, and maybe they're along a majority of the frontage, a percentage of those could be maintained through this, or if said rose bushes can't be put on the plant list for some reason. So they need to come off. What percentage of those would be reasonable to allow and say, this is reasonable to maintain? We chose to do 100% ground covers, ornamental grasses, because nobody has real passionate attachments to those typically, but some people do have passionate attachments to shrubs, trees.
And ideally, we want to keep mature trees, even if they're not on the list, unless they're invasive.
For sure.
That's tough. I don't think that accounts for everything probably that someone's gonna run up on, which is not what we're trying to
It
do,
gives
but
them-
it's
it gives them
definitely,
the ability to maintain at least, it's some flexibility versus being like, no, it's all gonna go. But then, of course, no matter where you put that metric, there's gonna be conflict. If it were 25%, you're gonna have issues. If
Yep.
it were even 50%, you're still gonna have issues. So it's a matter of where's the reasonable line for conflict.
And if we sacrifice too much on that number, then what we're trying to build here is kind of pointless.
You got it.
So yeah, it's really hard to say whether or not 90% in and of itself is a grand number, and 85 or whatever wouldn't be better, but ballparking it, I mean, I like the spirit behind it, which is that if something is truly sentimental, you can do your best to maintain it, but that as we grow as a town, everyone is going to need to come into compliance with these new.
I think a 10% can correlate similar to how we're doing turf at 10%. It can also correlate to rounded percentages, maybe trees, like Lexi said. There's mature trees, but not wanting to tear those out. So that ability to maintain those could be factored into a 10%, where I think is a reasonable approach that our consultants also, they were the ones who offered that, wasn't it?
I think it was Aurora, Colorado had something similar to this, like the percentage. And it seemed to work for our purposes. And I started at 85, but I think the easiest way to think through it is how either we're doing this by plant spread at maturity, like we're doing ground cover, like plant material, or it could be number of plants. So we have to decide how we're measuring it.
Yeah.
But if it is like number of plants, 9 out of 10 makes more sense than like 8.5 of your plants.
Yes. Give it that.
I have some half plants right now.
The deer eat.
I don't have deer, thankfully. All the grasshoppers in Moab. Yeah, I mean, again, it's not going to be a super quick, easy thing that no one has to make any changes, or else what's the point of the ordinance? But I think this does account for it. Point of clarification. Is this in-ground plants?
Yes, it would only be landscaping. So like if you had potted plants all over your
So
porch.
you could dig up your grandmother's rose bushes, put them in giant pots.
Yes, you
Thank you.
could totally do it.
Go. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Thank
solved
you
it.
for putting that on the record. Was that an internal discussion only, or did we have that?
It was internal. It was the
Yeah,
discussion.
We had that same
had.
discussion. Of,
Yeah.
oh, there's this whole other ability to give freedom, give flexibility.
Well, and that
is-
makes tons of sense too, because think of all the annuals that people have
Absolutely.
in pots.
that are hanging,
They're hanging
placed,
there.
whatever. it is.
And
Yeah.
you're building like, I don't, like if you're doing a building permit, like you don't have to report your hanging basket.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Not part of it.
And another thing too is like raised garden areas and that type of thing would be a lot more water conserving than putting it in the ground too.
Well, and
Just
the
thinking about that.
Raised garden areas though could be part of your landscape and might count.
I would agree with that.
What did you say?
The raised gardens will be a part of your landscaped areas.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would
but if
think-
it was a movable pot that you had
Mhm.
on your porch or
Right.
next to your driveway or whatever, that would not.
Right. But
I think that's an interesting definition to flesh out, just because like, if we are counting raised beds, I've also seen people like get a big stock tank and plant a bunch of things in it. And if it has a bottom on it that separates it from the ground underneath it, is it a really big pot? Or is it a raised bed?
that's worth.
This is the
chasing.
stuff I live for as a lawyer.
I mean,
I just
that-
have to tell I have to
I'm
tell you,
just-
I'm
I'm
just
just
like,
Thinking my way through it.
What is it?
Like,
I mean,
you know, because I've seen
That will come up.
I've seen that, and
Yeah.
I even in my own yard have stock tanks with, you know, butterfly bushes and stuff growing out of them. It's a great way to landscape with, you know, but
Was this
yeah,
your, I have a friend who
yeah, I mean, it
scenario?
could be me too. I'm just curious, you know, if you were to do something like, how would that all fall? Because
Yeah.
like, you're right, raised bed gardening is a great way to go. I definitely see that as landscaping because it is connected to the ground underneath it. But, you know, I've also seen big fancy pots in people's driveways that you certainly couldn't pick up and move without like a forklift. But does that count as landscaping, or does that count as a potted plant in their driveway?
Mhm.
And how, what's the measuring point? What becomes
Mhm.
part of the landscaping and what is just a potted plant?
And I think in this particular instance with what we were talking about earlier, that 90% number would be easier to decide on if I knew what metric was being used to measure the plant material.
Like what is the, oh, like whether it's
Yeah, whether or not it's
spread
number of
or whether it's
plants
number of
or
plants.
plant material.
I think, yes, spread, that's small.
Yeah,
10% seems
Mhm.
small.
that's kind of my thought.
For
Number
spread,
of plants, I
but
could
number of
see-
plants, it's not.
I could see like being able to hang on to 10% of your like number of plants, but like, you know, if you had a bunch of really nicely established, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something high water use. My brain says grapes and it depends on the grape. But yeah, like I'd be curious to know where we land on that number when we land on what metric we're measuring
I
now.
don't think it makes sense for it to be number of plants though, because you could keep all your rose bushes and just plant
bunch of
85
little-
more things that count. And then it's
Mhm.
like, hey, it's
Mhm.
only
Well,
ten
but
I think
does
that
that fit in your
spread
water
makes the
budget?
most sense.
Yeah.
And
But yeah,
measuring
that's-
trees the same way I felt like, as we were talking about before, trunks and not all of your canopy would also make
Mhm.
sense. So let's say that it's spread. What should the number be?
So if it's spread 10%.
That's so
feels
hard.
a little small.
I'm just thinking of a photo I just saw of someone who's had a rose bush in her yard here locally. That was her grandmother's rose bush. And it's like 5 times the size of her as a full grown adult woman.
Is it a percent of your yard? I mean, 25% live plant
Right.
material.
Yeah,
Yes.
my rose
Yeah.
bushes are only this big.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, that's a tough question.
This, I want to make note because this is the beauty of civics and working through ordinances like this, but this is where when you move into gray, you will
Mhm.
never find peace. So in black and white, it's clear, but if we are going the gray route, which is offering flexibility, it's going to get complicated to that point. And it's kind of a indefinite numeral in that case, where you're going to continue to be able to dive deeper and deeper. What's this? What's that? What's that? And within our code, we do have levels of interpretation that Alexi will have in this case to say that's not the intent or purpose of this ordinance, and I'm not going to review it in such a way of,
Mhm.
obvious manipulation of I have 1 rose bush, but now I plant 85 rose bushes, and now I get to keep all my originals.
Now I can keep the 10%.
But those types of questions never end. But anyway, that's my commentary on
Yeah.
this. Don't feel that we're going to get to the bottom of that pit tonight, because we probably will not.
In that instance, I think the intent and how this is written right now is sufficient to sort of capture things the best. This would be one where I'd love to check in on it in a little while.
I
Okay.
agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that this would be one to keep an eye on. And I think depending on how that onboarding plants on the list thing
Yeah.
works too,
Mhm.
that theoretically, if most of the things you wanted to preserve could simply be onboarded onto the list through that 3-step process or whatever, that you wouldn't need more than 10% to hang on to things that are definitely not on the list. Like they may not be noxious, but they're certainly not going to be on an approved plant list. If there's something that special to you, 10% should do it. And then hopefully everything else, hopefully the lady with the, massive rose bush can just get that one on the list. And we can say roses are close enough to being, water conscious that if you want to keep your rose bush, keep your rose bush.
It's like the idea of an approved plant list and a recommended plant list about breaking those out, because I think I would love to be able to account for existing things, but if we want, which it definitely serves as people to look for things that they should be planting or should be looking to, that's different than the you can have roses. It's fine, but we wouldn't want you to look at that and be like, oh, of all these things, I'm gonna plant the peonies or whatever it is.
Yeah, or
Or just an asterisk next to things on the list or
Yeah.
something that delineates the difference between
Mhm.
acceptable and recommended.
and some kind of mechanism to suggest or incentivize the plants we really want to see people planting.
Yeah.
There are plenty of plants on the approved plant list, but this selection of natives and whatever else really work for us. So even if they're just essentially the ones people see first when you're
Mhm.
scrolling through the plant list and you're trying to decide what you want to put in your yard or on your site plan, that your suggested things that we as a city want to see first. And then if you want to go out of your way and be I really want this in my yard, well, that may still be on the list and be approved. But if you're just kind of looking at it as what can I put here, that we put the things that we are most interested in an easy, kind of see it first kind of situation.
Mhm.
I think highlighting that with the bonus component
Yeah, I like
is kind of not maybe required as recommended, but
Right.
a required highlighted and then kind of a bar
Mhm.
required list that isn't
Yeah.
as high on the list, like Miles is saying, I think.
Or even
We
just kind
could-
of general suggestions, like you want roses and we could be like, oh, well, look at these wild roses that are far more water conscious than like
Mhm.
these hybridized versions that, you know, just something like that to kind of steer people towards what
Mhm.
we're looking for. And if their intent, it's one thing, but if
Mhm.
they're kind of just deciding, give them the option or
Mhm.
give them the information to kind of lead them towards the stuff we really want to see.
Okay, so the next question is about adding things to the plant list. These are our current criteria. It's pretty simple, but the last one's kind of vague. Do these look appropriate so far? Do you want to see more detail as we try to sort out recommended versus things you can have? We're also going to talk to engineering and streets a little bit more about how you would add specifically a street tree, like not just a tree on the list, but a tree that is appropriate to also plant a park strip. The main criteria we've gotten so far is not shallow roots.
One piece from staff, I was wanting to double check that the discretion is up to the planning director. Might we change that to
Yes,
correlation with zoning administrator?
yes.
That was my additional question that we had was to confirm planning commission was still good with that zoning administrator for exception reviews
Okay,
too.
we can also go up to that section.
Um, What-
Any comments on the criteria for approved plant list? Sufficient? Look in more detail on number 3.
The water-wise plant list, I've looked at it. There's a lot of plants on that list. And I'm assuming I've purchased plants at the nursery here. They're all plants we want to see here. And you can get your flowering and your pretty without having to plant something that's gonna take a lot of water. There's a lot of really good plants on the list.
I like that it's fairly simple. At the end of the day, I'm thinking about like people who have to deal with this to get their parking garage built, and like as easily digestible as we can make some things like this would be great. So
I will leave it as is for now. And then going to this section, so right now we have zoning administrator in charge of approving exceptions. So as a reminder, we have a list of exemptions, places that just don't have to do this right now, because their water conservation methods would be very different than what we would see at like a family development type structure. And then exceptions are for things that are not exempt, but for some reason are, it says literally practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships. You can apply for an exception. Right now it goes to the zoning administrator. And that's the question you were asking.
It was originally when we were framing this, I was wanting to kick it back to the body of the land use authority body, which could have been the zoning administrator, planning commission, or the city council, depending on the scope. However, I think with some feedback from the planning commission, it actually seems to make more sense overall to utilize the professional aspect, which will inevitably be the sustainability director to do this analysis, because as much as we all love our land use authority bodies, maybe you aren't as up to speed on some of those aspects where that will be Alexa's job to report back to you of here's why this exemption is being approved. Or excuse me, exception is being approved. So we changed that, and this would be just a corresponding point with the plant list edition. So if we're still okay with that.
yeah, that all sounds good to me.
All right, the next thing is we only have 2 left on my list, just so you know where we stand. Water budget. The water budget right now as we discussed earlier, it gives a bonus for having some of these special features. When it was a recommended plant list only, we had a bonus in there for getting things off the approved plant list, but now it's a required plant list. So the question is, do we want to keep this and incentivize other plants such as natives or pollinators or anything else, or do we want to cut it?
I do like the idea of having a bonus. Like we said, the plant list could become pretty darn exhausted pretty quickly. So having a bonus for native plants, having a bonus for the things we want to see that are, you know, particularly suited to our area, not just things that, you know, theoretically work all right here, would be worthwhile. And I especially like added benefits to the non-irrigated native vegetation, because there are plenty of plants out here that do just fine without any input from you, and they are great in your yard and easy to take care of, and as long as, you know, like, it's good things to have around.
And if it's driven the river, you'll take note of the glove mallow is so
It's
amazing.
off this year, yeah,
Drive north on 191, it's like more.
Really.
It's crazy.
like
Yeah,
fields of it.
Wow. Beautiful.
Yes. It is.
yeah, it's crazy. And then in my yard, it has mites. I'm like,
Oh, you're like, why?
Okay, leave it with native plants, or potentially if we have a subsection of our list that becomes recommended and approved, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and the last question is pretty broad, but we talked about for the reporting requirements for a general landscape plan, if you go prescriptive in particular, what you would need to do is we have like a sort of a checklist of things that you would have to do, but I think the basics of it are you need to know how big your yard is, plant list, and since hydrozones are required for prescriptive, it would be grouped by the watering requirements and some sort of estimate which we could facilitate of the size of your plant cover. Is that a reasonable requirement for people who are having to submit for the prescriptive option? This actual format will be refined, but do the best we can to make it simple to calculate. That is my last question.
thank you so much. I will kick it back to you guys. But I believe there was mention earlier of tabling this.
Yes, I think you'll see the action options for the commission tonight include a recommendation, a positive recommendation, negative recommendation, or option to table. At this point, given the volume of this ordinance, the limited public outreach that we've had come back, I am recommending that we table this, continue to reach out to the public, continue to refine out, schedule at our next meeting, if that seems to be the best, as well as also engage in our consultants who weren't able to be here for this meeting. And I don't think they'll even be there for our next.
I was gonna say,
The
we talked
coordination
about
on
this,
that.
but not, yeah.
They were a couple months out, which is why we ended up saying, let's just hold the public hearing and get this piece at least done. We can obviously, within planning commission, have the opportunity to bring public back in for commentary outside of the public hearing context if we choose. So that's my recommendation, is that we table this and then we'll bring it back as an action item, which we can continue to table until you're ready. I anticipate we will be ready at the next meeting, but then again, if the commission feels no, my answers still aren't quite addressed, we can table further. I do anticipate once we get to council, they're going to kick it back to you at least once. Maybe not. I've been shocked in the past before, but given the scope of this, as much as we can polish up before we bring it the best.
Can we give specific request or direction to, I guess, to Lisa's department?
Yes.
About what we think this should look like as far as asking for public input?
Yes.
I think it would be really great if on, the city has a monthly spotlight email it sends out.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any reason that they couldn't use that email to say, hey, everyone who's already on that mailing list, here is a copy of the ordinance as it stands right now.
Mhm.
What do you think?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
just-
Mhm.
yeah, with, give us input, and then similarly, same thing. I think it's really difficult for the public when it says public hearing, and then here's the agenda, and people have to go to the thing, and particularly with planning commission, because of action items, we don't often have the agenda until
Mhm.
really close to the meeting. We had a public notice in the paper weeks ago for
Mhm.
this, but
Correct.
the reality is the materials weren't out there yet.
Right.
So I think it's less useful when people can say, okay, the ordinance, but which version of the ordinance?
Mhm. Mhm.
Here it is, here's the ordinance, same thing on Facebook.
Yep.
Here's the ordinance, we want feedback. And then even just a quick landing page with a box on
Mhm.
it with a link to the ordinance or the text of the ordinance, and then the text box where people could even write it so they don't have to open their emails if they don't want to. I know we've done that for things in the past. I think that'd be great,
Absolutely. I
honestly.
agree.
Yeah.
I want the community to be engaged in this.
Mhm.
I don't think it can possibly be successful if they're not. And I
Yeah.
know a certain level of folks just won't be aware of it until they come to get a building permit.
Well,
That's
or until it gets to,
understandable.
and that's how we have the council issue, because once it gets to council, council has a little broader reach as far as public engagement.
Right.
Than the planning commission does. And so people hear about it for the first time, or they get nudged by someone who's on council to come
Right.
provide feedback. But at that point, it's already been through us.
Right.
Be really great.
So we're gonna do our best.
Do it in the June 1st, potentially.
We'll see if Ronnie could put it in her little
Absolutely.
write up too.
Sure.
What? Yeah.
And as you said, nudges.
Activate
within
the plant
community,
people
I
on
hope
Facebook.
It will continue to spread. Because again, if there's serious objection, we need to hear about that.
Yes, exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
And that is to say serious objection.
Yeah.
Obviously, this has been 2 years in the works. It's not news, but it is finally coming to
Mhm.
an event. So we do want to know in advance if
Yep.
there's something serious and genuine. Not, I don't like government, so no. I don't know if the city council will buy that.
Noted,
argument.
heard, always heard and noted.
That's all.
Okay, yeah,
But
I
that's a
think,
great suggestion.
I think that would be great. And honestly, it's something that's kind of exciting. I think it's something that a lot of
Yeah.
people at least temporarily agree on, regardless of kind of their thoughts about regulations. So
Mhm.
yes, thank you for passing that along and staying on that.
Just a note on that too. It just seems like every time I go to any kind of public meeting or open house or anything like that, that's one of the biggest things that come up is water conservation. So I feel like this ordinance is helping with giving the community what addressing their concerns too.
Mhm.
So
All right, we'll entertain a motion given that on our action item to either forward it with a positive recommendation, to forward the negative recommendation, or to table it for reasons.
I'm in favor of tabling it.
Want to make a motion?
Yeah. go ahead.
You don't have to read the whole thing.
Okay, perfect. I make a motion to table the proposed draft water efficient landscaping ordinance number 2023-08 and the rest of all of that, just due to a certain amount of incompleteness and a need for a little more public input.
Great, good motion by Miles,
I will second that.
seconded by Jill. Any discussion before we vote? Thank you all so much for all of your hard work.
Lots of
Lexi,
work,
this is very impressive.
very.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes unanimously. That is tabled. All right. Next item is 5.2, consideration of resolution 18/2023, a resolution approving the Marcus Court minor subdivision of property located at 347 Marcus Court. This is also a briefing and possible action.
All right.
Thank you, Alexi.
Thank you, Alexi. We will keep this item fairly short and in such don't have a large presentation. So I'm going to share the proposed survey draft plat to identify what we're looking at here is a simple minor subdivision application of an existing build. Oh, this is the wrong survey that was attached. Well, that's inconvenient. Hold a moment.
It's the one where they've already built
It's that big monster.
Correct.
the duplex or whatever that is.
Correct. That will need to be amended into the motion is that the survey on the agenda summary is not the correct survey. Let's see if I can pull the correct survey up. And you might be into the punch here. If you find it, just let me know. I apologize. This is important to have displayed. Go ahead and share screen again. And what you're going to note here from what I had shown was the update identifying the existing structure. So this was a vacant lot that was developed into a duplex. The duplex was built with the intention of a possibility for a twin home, which is what's happening here, a twin home subdivision. So that lot line goes down through the party wall or center line firewall between the two dwelling units on either side and then to the street. So fairly straightforward development. Where this was unique and what you're seeing is the additional identifications on the survey plat are the easement locations. So within the right of way, which is this Marcus Court area, the asphalt ends about where that Marcus Court identifier is. So currently an insufficient standard cul-de-sac. In order to maintain as many trees on site as possible, which there were a number of really pretty, I think they were,
Pine trees.
Mhm.
yeah,
They're big ponderosas. Yeah.
lodgepole, beautiful.
They're beautiful.
And because of the extensive improvements required by the individual property owner, the adjacent property you'll see off to the west side was at the time owned by the same property owner, provided sufficient emergency access, of which the cul-de-sac was essential. So they did not improve the rest of the cul-de-sac. They allowed the driveways to go and connect to the right of way as they were approved at the building permit stage for duplex. All we're doing is dividing the property in half with this action and securing that these easements are in place. So it's important that we're showing that survey plat, but also this additional easement on the neighboring property to allow for that emergency access shall be maintained as long as that property is operating as is. So on the record, I think we're kind of stating that outright, that this easement cannot be abandoned without amending the situation of what was lot 9 and what will now become lot 9A and lot 9B. Are there any questions on that? So a straightforward action, but with a slightly complicated process to get to that approval.
So that easement's already in existence. They're
Yes.
already using that to access the property, and we're just saying they will continue to maintain it.
The easement on the west property is intact and recorded currently. This survey plat and approval we make now will continue that access as well as establish this 10-foot utility.
Okay.
Utility easement wrapping, public utility easement wrapping property and the division. So he handled as much as he could prior to this action, and now with this action, we'll solidify the rest of that continuation of access.
Okay.
And a component of that was a condition of approaching approval was that there was another tree on property that needed to be removed, which I believe had been removed at the time of this meeting. So that condition is no longer attached to this approval.
What did you say needed to be added to the?
Yes, so within the motion, I'd like to add that the survey shown as Exhibit 4 was the previously submitted survey. We needed to be noted that the survey displayed on the screen currently identifying the existing structures and updated easements is the correct survey to be approved.
Any questions? Any more discussion? Anyone want to make a motion? So it's in the agenda summary, as usual, recommended motion, but then adding that the.
The
my brain is not
submitted
working.
Exhibit 4 was the incorrect survey. We want to on record approve the updated survey, which shows the existing structures.
Okay, well, I will make a motion to, I move forward with a positive recommendation to the city council on the Moab City Resolution 18-2023, a resolution approving the Marcus Court minor subdivision of property located at 347 Marcus Court, Moab, Utah, 84532, with the updated version of Exhibit 4
Mhm.
with the corrected version of the exhibit presented.
Perfect. That'll work for me.
That works.
As
That
as we're
works.
recommending this, we'll fix all this for city council.
Yeah,
obviously.
okay, yeah.
We're okay.
I'll second that.
All right, recommendation by Jill, second by Miles. Any discussion? This is good. Looks good.
That's good.
All in favor?
I
Aye. Motion passes unanimously. All right. Whew, I'm tired.
Well done, everyone. So
Long day.
one more thing.
field day.
Oh yeah, you had a long day. All right, item number 6 is a discussion item. Community services permitted use concept and residential. I'm not sure what that symbol is supposed to denote.
Greater or less than.
Is that greater or less than?
We're gonna say inversion.
Okay,
Inversion.
commercial district inversion. I think I've seen like, I guess you're right, greater. I was expecting a like a dash.
We won't read too much into my symbology with that discussion.
It's almost the like cat face emoji.
I'll be sure to include the cat face next time.
I would die if
Just
there were,
lots.
if there was like old school emoji, like symbol emojis in some text sometime.
So we are just after 10 minutes till 8. I kind of committed myself to a hard stop of 8. My family is also suffering from that terrible ick.
Oh, no.
So I'm needing to get back and feed them.
Oh, no. Where'd they get it?
I don't know.
They're not in school yet.
No, the little baby's had it twice, so we're actually a little worried about
no.
him.
Oh,
Uh,
Lord.
So with this, we have talked to Kai about this concept and wanting to give, I think, enough time for food for thought to develop within the conversation that we'll have for the full discussion. But introduce these tonight, which I think we can do in 5 minutes, and then we can close or continue the discussion. I'll just remove myself. The first aspect of this is the community services permitted uses, or the concept thereof, is that in our community, what we're, and it does attach itself to this later aspect of the conversation, is a struggling sector of what we'll call, for lack of a better term, community services. So not community service in a sense, but those nonprofits and local entities that are solely geared to managing and taking care of our community. We have a number of agencies that we work with all the time, but within our use palette, and then also within our zoning districts, don't carve out a, I think, decently appropriate zone for these to be housed where they're not either competing with highest and best use commercial or highest and best residential. So in order for them to actually have facilities or expand in ways they need, it's nearly impossible. And we've been seeing that coming back to the planning department staff over and again. How can we make this work? They're trying to navigate within the rules that we have. It's not effectively working for those entities. And we want to, I think, maybe carve these out as a standalone and give them a true opportunity where maybe highest and best uses can't quite reach. So it would be a new permitted use to maybe areas that otherwise don't have competition. So thinking about, for example, City Hall is kind of nestled directly within the center town site of Moab, but we're actually in a C2 zone, but actually within really smack dab of an R3 multi-household zone. Now within that, the ball fields used to be bordered by local commercial historically. And we see remnants of that and even some legal non-conforming uses still sticking around here. But this is where we see our civic campus naturally wanting to congregate. We do have a resources campus that's developing over at the old Utah State campus, and which is excellent. I think a lot of these entities were going to flock there because this entity or this other entity have now purchased and carved out space for them. But even within that, there's competition and issues happening that people can't fit. So it might make sense for us to identify, okay, where is the naturally civic engaging area and where would it make sense to butt up against the uses that already reside there? Because obviously we're going to have to be pushing somebody out in a sense, or making room for these. But I think these are just so essential to our community, they need to be identified. So this has been brought up before. And again, we have not included this in hot topics. I'll leave it at that. We can have this as food for thought for another communication, or after 8, if you want to continue and talk about it for the record, that'd be excellent as well. The next topic, which is the much more broad topic, we've discussed with Kai and wondering, okay, do we want to introduce this to the commission? I think we do, but we want enough time for you guys to have thought on this, is that what we're broadly seeing, because of the intensities of development, the way, all of these aspects of market, interest rates, sorry, my brain's not working terribly well now. The competing features that are pushing highest and best use have actually naturally been inverting our community. So why I'm using that term is that we're seeing businesses and startups and entrepreneurship not going and flocking to commercial sectors, but being pushed because they cannot compete with the highest and best uses, which are kind of gathering around the tourism resource industry, into our residential zones. They're applying for home occupations, but they're not home occupations. They're meant to be businesses, but they're trying to, again, wedge themselves into a license category that doesn't fit them. So they're finding nothing but trouble just trying to survive and become a sustainable community that way. Yet on the flip side, we're not seeing new commercial spaces being developed to accommodate for these. We're actually seeing our commercial spaces, because of our high density allocations for housing, flip to residential. So our commercial is becoming residential, our residential is becoming commercial. The original onset of this is that's not what we want to see. That was my natural reaction initially. But the more time I was spending with this is looking periodically in how long zoning has really existed as a traditional practice, and then even with some of the more modern practices of planning, there are definitely decade paradigms and evolution of a thought of planning and how we collect, organize, and operate as a community. And maybe this isn't something that we are needing to fight against, but maybe evaluate a little further and say, well, if this is naturally happening, how can we be doing it well, doing it right, or better? So that's where it becomes, how does the community or representatives of the community feel about that? I think traditionally it's really easy to say, no, that stays over there, this stays over there. But clearly that's not working as is, because it's disintegrating as we speak. This is something we brought up with council. It's long-term on the books, but the more I think we can start talking about this, maybe the more staff can start crafting an analysis of how to approach a solution, an alternative, contributing mechanisms to this, how we can get there. So that's my introduction to those two pieces. Maybe any quick thoughts on that? It is 8 o'clock on the dot, so I'm gonna start excusing myself and kind of logging out, but
Yeah,
I'd love to hear
absolutely.
any comments as we wrap up.
I think that's worth
And then Anna, would you mind doing future agenda items?
really,
Just as I am working my way out.
really talking seriously about, I think it's a thing that's not going away. You know, we've talked about this.
I
and
agree. I think it's definitely something for a discussion.
Yeah. That's all I've got tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks for the intro.
Sure. What I think we'll do is we'll keep this on as a discussion item and kind of build it up.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much if we do have such a heavy item like we did,
Mhm.
but maybe give you enough advance notice that, hey, we're actually going to engage in this.
Yeah.
Maybe try to pull the community in.
Yep,
I
that'd be
see as
great.
Well.
Any more like context or information you can give like leading into it to really understand like what types of businesses are, moving from one to the other, or why would we make one decision or the other? That would be,
Bakers,
yeah. Bakers, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, like,
people who need kitchen space, that's a huge one, I
Yeah.
think, in this.
Mhm.
When they maybe have the ability to do it at their,
We've seen everything from florists to bakers. I mean, we within the home occupation front have seen things traditionally like healing practices, massage or therapy, things that are kind of trending away from a desk home
Yeah.
occupation, which is the intent of home occupation. You at a desk with a computer,
Yep.
that's all you're doing. Is getting basically their public is coming in more and more, or you're having a more diverse experience.
Yeah.
Where that home is no longer really functioning as a home. Now we're getting into factory and institutional uses, which are
Mhm.
problems for people because it's changing their building occupancy, and that's where they're running into big issues.
Yeah.
We've talked about something in the past called this staircase. What am I call it?
Spiral.
Spiral staircase. Man, you can tell I'm tired. A spiral staircase. So we'll hear that commentary come back of why that spiral staircase effect is basically creating significant challenges. During the Grand Summit, this was brought up. We never did have the opportunity to actually recirculate back and actually communicate on it. It was just brought up and kind of left. So this is where I'd like, let's bring this back to the table and discuss it.
curious to have a deeper discussion about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. I will adjourn this meeting at 8:03 PM.